Today's episode of The Bluff is sponsored by SitRep. SitRep is an notorious open source intelligent app that provides the latest updates for over 180 countries and over 500 topics, allowing you to stay ahead and informed. Now available on Apple and Google. Thank you, SitRep, for sponsoring this episode.
Welcome back to the Bottom Line Up Front, an Artorias podcast. I'm Matt.
And I'm Stefano, the Chief Intelligence Officer of Artorias.
And I am Christian, the CEO of Artorias.
So this episode is going to be a two-part special for The Bluff, in which we're going to focus on tomorrow's meeting between Russian President Putin and U.S. President Donald Trump, and their highly anticipated bilateral meeting to go over the possibility of either reaching a ceasefire or even a peace deal related to Ukraine and the Russians invaded to Ukraine. This episode is being recorded on a Thursday, the day prior to the conference, and then we will have a separate episode on Saturday to kind of get the reactions and see where we're at. This is a very highly anticipated meeting. We know Donald Trump has this very strong belief of personal relationship as a president. We've seen this historically in the first Trump administration with Kim Jong-un, the president of North Korea, where there was a moment of extreme tensions. We all can remember the famous cabinet meeting where President Trump threatened fire and fury, Little Rocket Man during the UN General Assembly, to then eventually led into a personal meeting that, at least at the short term, did provide a detente, but really did not provide a long-term solution to the Korean Peninsula. And in many ways, the North Koreans kind of view any direct negotiations with the United States as a wasted time and a wasted opportunity, and they're increasing their rhetoric, their tensions, and even their military footprint as we see North Korean soldiers in Russia right now fighting for the Russians against Ukrainians. And so this episode, we're going to go over what we anticipate tomorrow's meeting is going to be like, what are the likely outcomes, the different possibilities. But I think we can all agree that this is a significant meeting, a significant bilateral in-person meeting. And with that, I'm going to go first to Christian. Christian, we've known President Trump at the beginning of his second administration was putting a lot more pressure on Ukraine compared to Russia. But now it does seem like there has been a switch in which the Trump administration has been more hawkish now against the Russians. They're pushing a lot of the blames on the Russians for their inability to reach either a ceasefire or peace treaty. President Trump has openly stated his frustration with Vladimir Putin directly. And it does look like he is coordinating with Ukraine and our European allies and understanding that territorial concessions for territorial concessions and not on the table, and that this is going to be a hard-term negotiation. But Christian, what do you think is going to be the outcomes tomorrow? Do you think President Trump will continue a hawkish approach, or do you think there might be more dovish a detente?
I will answer this question as long-winded as I usually do, and I want to preface the conversation with a couple really crucial factors that the audience might not be privy to, and that is the meeting that happened between Zelensky and Trump, as well as some of his cabinet, where it got really heated. That happened, and then there was kind of like a lull for a little bit and a lot of questions, and every analyst under the sun was wondering if Trump was just going to completely side with Russia on this, and that was going to be his off-ramp forward, is just allowing Russia to keep waging the war. And then we started to see some of the rhetoric change. Trump famously in a press conference started talking about how Melania was coming home when he was getting home, and they would talk about the war, and that Trump would be on a call with Putin and Melania that day, and then get home, and Melania would tell him that Putin had bombed an elderly home or a school or a hospital. And that kind of changed Trump's rhetoric significantly. Within 72 hours of that press conference, Trump completely 180'd on his arms dealings to Ukraine. He was doing a temporary pause, is what he was calling it beforehand, to kind of see if they would come to an agreement together. And then when Melania started saying that, he completely 180'd that stance and was like, all right, we're just gonna have to give Ukraine more arms as well as more targeting, which is exactly what we saw. After that conversation happened, there was a really big push on the Trump administration's part to get Moscow and Kyiv in a room together. And there was pushes every which way. The US helped us some Middle Eastern allies as well to try to get them all there. It kind of fell apart. Putin refused to come to any of the meetings that Zelensky was at, and vice versa. And even today, we're still seeing that with this summit. This is only a summit between Putin and Trump. Let's let's not like completely glaze over that fact as well. And that will obviously base for my opinion of where this conflict goes from here, especially at the summit in a minute when I get to that. But I just want to preface those two major points that the reason the summit happened is, from my perspective, the Trump administration is putting immense pressure on Putin and his administration right now, that he needs to come to some sort of resolution with this, and he needs to come to it immediately. Trump has long stated zero intentions of telling the world what he intends to do if Russia does not come to a peaceful resolution in the near term. But according to some inside sources, it is going to be more military aid to Ukraine in the short term, as well as strike and targeting, as well as giving Ukraine the ability to strike even further into Russian territory. And that's not to say that they're not already doing that. I don't think that that is going to be a giant precipice for the changing of the war. And I also don't think the economic sanctions and tariffs and embargoes that the United States plans also will have any real sway in terms of how it impacts Russia. Tertiary to all of this, I would like to bring up the fact that Trump and the Indian government have been going very back and forth recently regarding the Russian oil sanction mitigation, if you want to call it that, that India has been playing and buying really cheap Russian oil and kind of keeping the Russian economy afloat. That has actually boiled over into what would be classified as a diplomatic severing, if you will. The Americans and the Indians are really fighting right now in regards to this issue, and it is in the backdrop of all of this happening right now. But to answer your question, Stefano, I just wanted to give the listeners some context. I believe in a very hawkish and warmongering approach to this, which has usually been my MO through this entire time I've been watching this conflict, even prior to the conflict happening. This has a lot of callbacks to previous conflicts that the United States hasn't necessarily been involved in, but we've kind of been teetering on the involvement ladder. We've been giving arms, or we've been giving intelligence, and we're getting really frustrated with the opposing side not coming to a resolution on whatever case it is. I do not see that this talk goes smoothly. I do not see a formal resolution happening. On my side of the aisle, I stand on the opinion that Putin is a strongman and he does it very well. I mean, he was KGB for years and years. He basically consolidated power within his own country, which is a really spread out country with a lot of different political leanings. And he was able to consolidate power in half a decade and has controlled power since that day. Trump, on the other hand, is, in my opinion, a sheep in wolf's clothing in regards to how he is a strongman. Trump has no background in intelligence, has no background in military. He has a background of being a failed business owner multiple times. And being a business owner and being in intelligence are completely different ball games and trying to keep your head on. Like, great leaders are never really called upon for being exceptionally well in terms of what they do in terms of policy or what they do in terms of changing the world, but more on how can they keep their head cool during times of crises. I mean, look at Churchill, look at Bush, etc. Like, people really gravitate towards leaders that can keep their cool in situations and don't blow things up more than they are. I know you mentioned it, Stefano, in your point, but the situation with North Korea can be highlighted for the situation we're in now. We have Trump, who is talking to another strongman. That strongman has no reason to listen to Trump in any sort of capacity. Economically, there's no reason to, because, well, it's North Korea, and Russia is now kind of ostracized in that same way in a lot of ways on the world stage. So economically, he has no leverage. Militarily, yes, he can go and fight, but that's going to be dragging the United States into what would be called World War III, and I'll call it that, or do nothing. And if we go back to the North Korea situation, where Trump, again, sheep in wolf's clothing, thinks he's a strong man, gets really furious, loses his temper immediately after realizing that, okay, this is going to be a lot harder in terms of the negotiation than I initially anticipated. I feel like that is going to echo identical to how it's happening with Putin right now. But I don't think Putin necessarily A, gives a flying fuck about what happens at this summit, and B, isn't going to be swayed left or right or even center on what Trump says to him during this summit. I think this is all really just showboating for Putin to his own populace that is kind of weary of what's happening in their own economy and the military, obviously. And they're just trying to like be like, okay, is my leader absolutely batshit, or is he willing to find an off-ramp for this conflict? Putin's been very clear through the entire negotiation process of this war that he has zero interest on conceding, walking away, putting his hands up, and walking out of Ukraine. I don't think that's going to happen. I think Russia is going to go in there with the exact same security guarantees that they wanted previously, which is they're going to control Zaporizhia, they're going to control Donetsk, they're going to control Luhansk, and they're going to control, like, I'm forgetting the last four, the fourth one right there. But there's a famous map of Putin that he points at in one of these things in early 2023 where he was like, yeah, this is the territory that I'm going to control at the end of this, no matter what. Again, I don't see where Trump has any sort of leverage right now, and I think that's a dangerous place for us to be in, because now we're involving ourselves into a conflict on a very high level diplomatic standpoint, and that is where push comes to shove in a lot of situations. Because again, Trump was voted in for a lot of reasons, for a lot of people, for the ending of the conflict in the Middle East, the conflict in Russia and Ukraine. The Middle East, as we all know, is still a shit show. It's only getting worse. The conflict in Ukraine is a shit show and only getting worse. I don't think the summit really changes much. It's just, how much does it change the catalyst for the Americans? Does Trump walk away from this, throw his hands up and be like, okay, guys, my constituents, sorry, I messed up. I thought I could end this war. Or does he go on a 180 like he usually does and go completely nuts? And F-35s are flying over Ukrainian airspace in 2 weeks. It's kind of those two catalysts on how far Trump pushes this, but I do not see this being a Russia perspective change in any capacity. I would love to be wrong. I'd love for the summit to end tomorrow. There's a joint press conference. Putin says, I'm withdrawing my troops from controlled territory. Maybe there's some territory concessions made on the Ukrainian part and it's over. But I just don't see that happening in reality. But I thank you for the question, Stefano, and hopefully I didn't take the stage too long.
No, it's perfect. And it's interesting, the India piece. We are seeing a more hawkish approach. It's actually interesting, and maybe this is something we need to discuss in a future episode, how U.S.-Pakistani relations, ironically, are going back up and tensions with India are going down. I do believe that there's a lot of this where President Trump, I think we do know, is very adamant of trying to achieve the Nobel Peace Prize. We actually got reporting from Norwegian press that President Trump actually approached that subject directly to the president of Norway. I mean, he does like to claim that many wars he ends. Like, for example, one of the interesting ones he says is DRC Rwanda, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Rwanda. It's important to note that M23 continues their offensive operations in Eastern Congo, as Matthew is very well aware of in the episodes we had about that. That war has not been solved, and it risks any diplomatic effort in collapsing because the M23 continues to launch their offensives, obviously with the backing of Rwanda. Azerbaijan, Armenia, he did get that kind of solidified in the treaty done, but I think a lot of that was kind of fait accompli because Azerbaijan decisively won militarily, and this was a push that was going on for years now, and by both during the Biden and Trump administration. And this, I think a lot of us were looking at this as a matter of time of when, not if, and then obviously Thailand and Cambodia, the border conflicts. So I do believe there's some of that in the Nobel Peace Prize aspect for President Trump that he's looking for. I think he's looking for this. But, I think it's going to be, he's even acknowledged how hard it's been. And you are, again, as highlighted, there has been an increase in rhetoric against Russia compared to early in this administration, which was against Zelensky, and that has a change. What I do believe is that Putin, though, is delusional in the sense that his military and the Kremlin continuously to believe that the Ukrainian defense is about to crumble any second now. And they're going to look at Prokhorovsk, the situation there, and you will see people highlight how Russia is making the most advances they've had in years. And I think people need to understand we're talking about at most 5 kilometers, a couple hundred soldiers, and Ukrainian has already sent reinforcements to try to shut that gap out. And we're talking about a very small tactical breakthrough that is not going to have major operational changes. And I think the Russian military is continuing to fed false narratives to the Kremlin, feeding into a belief that President Putin believes that victory is nigh and that Ukraine will completely capitulate, which I think is outside of the realm of possibility. And they still have maximalist demands, as in Ukraine has to pull out of Kherson, the city that they recaptured in 2023, which will never happen. And Russia has no military capability of doing that in the near term, or even in the long term, for that matter. But Matt, let me go to you. I mean, I'm going to ask you the same question. What is your predictions for tomorrow? Do you believe that President Trump is going to be more hawkish, or is this something where President Putin is going to try to salvage some way, shape, or form, or delay the sanctions or more arms, or try to maybe push this on the Ukrainians? What do you think your predictions are? And the second question related to kind of our European and Ukrainian allies, there does seem to be a lot of coordination between the Europeans and Ukraine on this. Is that a venue where they are also managing Trump's expectations, where maybe President Putin should not be trusted?
So first of all, I don't think anyone is effectively managing Trump's expectations or providing a knowledge base to have him on strong footing for this meeting with Putin. What we've seen from Witkoff, who's become this multifaceted negotiator, has been lacking, to say the least. So he always seems to confuse the situation more after a meeting with someone like Putin or with Iran than going into it. He's made the mistake that I think several people have made before him of going into these meetings, specifically people with the Trump administration and Trump himself, without a bench and of people with the knowledge to make these effective meetings, at least from the U.S. perspective. They don't even bring, Witkoff hasn't even brought note takers to take official notes on the discourse that is taking place in these meetings, and that does not bode well for something tangible or positive to really come out of this. So I don't have very high hopes. I don't know exactly what Trump's reaction is going to be because he's very unpredictable. I don't like the way he's talking about this in, his real estate terms, talking about land swaps and talking about oceanfront property and the value of it. I don't think that is how the Ukrainians see it. It's really, I think, insulting to the Ukrainians as well that they're not sitting at the table and the aggressor, Vladimir Putin, is. So this is not an ideal setting, to say the least, for actually coming up with something that is going to be effective long term. I think the best case scenario is a limited ceasefire, and maybe we get some sort of framework similar to what we saw in the run up to Trump taking office of, presenting a framework for a ceasefire in Gaza. I don't think that there's going to be anything concrete. I think that is the best case scenario. But the problem here is Putin has told us exactly what he wants, what his beliefs are. So there's not really a question about how he views this conflict and how much he's willing to sacrifice to achieve those aims. And I don't think Trump fully understands that. He thinks that, he can glad hand him and, we can make some lucrative deal and everyone's going to be happy and we can walk away from this. He's trying to put together this sort of quick fix that just doesn't have reality behind it. So we're having this conversation on US soil in Alaska between Trump and Putin. We are not going to have the seasoned diplomats in the room to help guide this conversation and keep Trump focused on an actual policy or aims, I think he's going to be shooting from the hip, and that could go either direction. In terms of the leverage that Trump can bring to bear, all I can really think of is threats to like really go after more aggressively China and India for purchasing Russian oil and potentially sending more weapons to Ukraine. That's another, sort of schizophrenic policy that we've seen from this White House. Just a week after the DoD announced a pause to weapon shipments, they flipped on that and came out and said that they would continue sending those weapons to Ukraine. But Trump is still of the mindset, and you get this from some of the conversations and the way he talks about this, when Ukraine was saying that whatever comes out of this, they're still going to have to get approval to enact it. And that bothered Trump. So Trump came out and says, I don't understand how he needs to get this congressional approval, but he can just go about starting to kill people. And this frames Ukraine not as the country defending themselves, but as the country being an aggressor or at least an equal participant with Russia. And so if that is the way he is thinking about this, then I wouldn't trust him to have that country's best interest. And speaking of best interest and having it in mind, there's no doubt that there are going to be discussions. This is a discussion about European security. And who's missing from that discussion? Our close allies in NATO, the Europeans. I, I don't like this setup. This whole thing makes me very uncomfortable. And I don't think that he is bringing anyone into this who can help guide comprehensive policy. I don't think we're walking away from this. I don't think Putin is walking away with any sort of concessions. He's to some extent already gotten what he wants, and that is he's being legitimized as a power. He has always taken issue with Obama calling him a regional power. Now he's showing he's the one at the table, and he won't sit down with Zelensky because he doesn't believe that Ukraine even has a right to exist on its own. And it's just not a recipe for anything constructive to come out of this. And I think he's walking away with his maximalist aims intact, and from what he sees as a win domestically and propaganda-wise. And we've completely undermined all of the effort that we've seen over the last 3 years to isolate Russia.
Well, I guess one of the things that I would kind of push back a little bit is that we have seen reporting from European press that the Americans have stated that, we are not going to entertain even territorial concessions without the Ukrainians. Vice President J.D. Vance has had conversations with our European allies prior to this. He was in Europe recently and had multiple conversations with the UK, French, and Germany. And we did get reporting from German diplomats, J.D. Vance saying, no territorial concessions without the direct participation of the Ukrainians, that this is an attempt to see where the Russians are at. Even Marco Rubio in a press statement, because I think you're right. I think the criticism, a lot of this, what we saw was Steve Witkoff's meeting with Putin. It does look like Steve Witkoff is way out of his league. His interpretations of the meetings with Putin were widely misunderstood, and there was an idea that there was even a possibility that Russia was going to withdraw to just Donetsk and Luhansk. That was complete, and that's what he briefed. And then we had subsequent reporting directly from the Russians saying absolutely not, that their maximalist demands is not going. But Steve Witkoff already put everything in motion, and President Trump said, okay, let's have this meeting. But even a lot of our European allies have been briefed on this, and we're not necessarily seeing, at least from their end, a lot of concern. I would say President Zelensky has been very forceful in public statements stating unequivocally, again, that is up to the parliament to decide, and it's part of the Constitution that they cannot relinquish territory.
So just
I
quickly,
think,
can I push back on the pushback? Because I think you know this to some extent. Vance is the person they trot out to put a little patina of professionalism on this. He and Rubio are this little dog and pony show. At the end of the day, the person sitting at the table has said exactly that. Trump has said there will be swaps, and that's a quote, and he said good swaps for both countries, some bad swaps. That so he's going into this completely undermining the statements made by the two people that you just mentioned, which is why I think like there is this level of confusion and conflict in terms of what we're even going into this to achieve. I think the other thing to know is when dealing with the conversation around the way this is being framed by Europeans, a lot of world leaders have learned how to engage with Trump, and a lot of that is through flattery and clientelism and just not going too aggressively. That doesn't mean that those are the conversations that are happening behind closed doors. I bet you a lot of people, I'm willing to bet a lot on this, a lot of the folks within the NATO infrastructure are very concerned by this.
I just want to jump in as well in regards to that. And I have a lot of levels of concern regarding that. And that is another reason why I am so hawkish and why I do want to point out the fact that Trump unequivocally cannot negotiate because he just doesn't have any leverage. Like when I started seeing the rhetoric, I mean, on Truth Social and stuff that he was saying in press conferences in this last week since this was even announced that the summit was going to happen, him talking about natural resources and like the changeover. I just want to be very, very clear. And Trump has like proposed this idea of like Russia getting access to some sort of trades within Alaska or within Ukraine. There is nothing either of those two places, like from a mineral perspective or a natural resource perspective, that Russia doesn't already have within their own sovereign borders. There's nothing more or control that they have in other areas of the world, such as Africa and some parts of Central Asia. So I'm just not seeing like what the plan is going into this pitch meeting that Trump's setting up. And it's a lot of like, oh, this sounds like a great idea, but at the end of the day, like what leverage is that? I'm gonna bring a guy into a room that has everything and be like, hey, you guys want some more? You know, in exchange for you not taking over control of this country that if I don't touch with or give arms to this country that you're invading is just gonna be yours anyways. Like I'm just not seeing like how that plays out in what levers Trump has in order to put this in a restful place. I'm just honestly, and then again, that is why I'm so hawkish, is because I know from Putin's perspective going into this situation that he has all of the cards. He knows how the situation is going to go. And yes, it is a beautiful off ramp for Putin if he wants to take it. But historically, Putin's gotten dozens of off ramps before this and has taken zero of them. So I don't see Putin taking an off ramp. He knows he has all the cards. Does this infuriate Trump to the point that this conflict escalates?
And I think maybe that's a good time, Stefano, to reverse the question and ask you, what are your predictions here? And do you see Trump going into this hawkish? Or do you think if he might become hawkish during the course of the meeting? What's your takeaway on this?
Yeah, no, I mean, I do believe that it's going to be a more hawkish. I do believe that this is where the change in the rhetoric that we're seeing and even the actions, and I think we can't undervalue the NATO Secretary General's trip and meeting with Trump, how that fundamentally changed a lot of the issues in the perspective of the Trump administration, and specifically Trump's, personally related to Ukraine. And I mean, I think you kind of highlighted the clientelism and all that. But that arms deal is a significant deal that will benefit Ukraine, and we've already seen that kind of translated into Ukraine. I think one of the main issues that Ukrainians are running into right now is more of an issue with their conscription. So I think that deal has solidified America's role, and it placates one of Trump's at least campaign promises of and kind of this magosphere and this isolationist fear saying, "Oh, no money to Ukraine, all for America." He's now able to frame this as, "No, no, no, they're purchasing us. This is trade." Just with weapons, and that ability, that NATO agreement to then leverage that to push into Ukraine has been very beneficial. And even during the NATO summit and the deal and the agreement, they are including, weapons and monetary aid to Ukraine as part of NATO defense spending, which, we might agree or disagree with it. I think it's smart and I think it makes sense because in the European perspective and their security perspective, Russia, it continues to be the primary threat for European security, and anything they do to help Ukraine undermines the Russian military. And to be frank and honest, the Russian military is in a very disastrous state as a conventional military force, and they're fighting akin to the Iranians during the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s. We saw how then, even the Iraqis in a very similar way, and we saw how the Iraqis fared against the U.S. during the 1991 Gulf War. So I think that is the way where we're kind of seeing that change. And I think there also is an understanding that Zelensky wants a ceasefire. He's been very clear. He wants an unconditional 30-day ceasefire to then start with serious negotiation, and has been very open to meeting Putin directly, and even called Putin out on a bluff, saying, I will meet you in Istanbul directly to negotiate this, because President Putin said, oh, we'll send a delegation to Istanbul. President Zelensky basically said, bet I'll meet you there, and Putin backtracked. And I think Zelensky also has been very adept at pointing out the hypocrisy of Russia, where they say something, which then goes to Christian's earlier point, where they might say great things on the phone, and Trump goes, and then Melania says, well, they just bombed a Ukrainian civilians. And I think that's where Zelensky has been very effective of saying, we want an unconditional ceasefire to then do negotiation. And that has been the position. I just don't see President Putin accepting that, because in his mind, he believes victory is imminent. And I think it will give him a very abstract or a very disillusional type of view in negotiating with Trump. And I think they're putting a lot of emphasis on this. And I would be interested to see how Trump kind of perceives that. And just because a press conference is scheduled doesn't mean it's going to happen. I mean, we saw that historically in the past, where the very famous cabinet Oval Office meeting between President Trump and President Zelensky that went absolutely disastrously. The press conference was canceled and they told Zelensky to leave. That is a possibility that might happen as well. I wouldn't discount that. I'm cautious, but I do believe that Zelensky and the Europeans have been very effective at pointing out that the problem of this war is not the Ukrainians, it's the Russians. And I think President Trump also sees that. And although he might still both sides this, a lot of the pressure is getting on Putin. And I think, and at least from the administration as a whole, the thing is, does Trump continue that hardline position during direct conversations with President Putin tomorrow? And we'll see where the press conference goes from there.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And the point you make about the state of the Russian military, I think, is a testament to how hard-headed Putin is, and how much he wants to achieve those aims that he has set forth. And I think when I was talking about the European leaders and some of the concern there is, does Trump understand that Putin wants to drive back the NATO borders to the 1997 borders? I think the Europeans and NATO members in Europe understand that intrinsically. I don't know if Trump does, but I do think that we are seeing a little bit more fire from Trump. He came out with this sort of self-imposed deadline for the ceasefire, and then when that came, he came out with this idea for a summit. So he is shooting from the hip, but clearly he's trying to push this forward. And I think, again, to your point, is this is part of him trying to come up with a solution before the end of his term. I just don't think it's that easy.
And actually, while we were recording this episode, I think this is important to highlight based on SITREP. We just got a very interesting alert that I will kind of highlight. It appears, based on open source reporting, and again from SITREP, that a pair of B-2 Alpha Spirit long-range strategic stealth bombers with the U.S. Air Force have landed in Elmendorf Air Base in Anchorage, Alaska, which is the exact location tomorrow where President Trump and President Putin will meet directly, right? So the U.S. has deployed B-2 bombers to Anchorage, Alaska, in the exact area where they're meeting. And for our listeners, just as a reminder, the B-2 bombers were the bombers used to strike the Iranian nuclear facility. I mean, Matt, Christian, and let me go to Christian for this. That's signaling right there. I think that kind of goes into this idea of a hawkish approach that President Trump is going to send, deploying B-2 bombers to the area where they're going to meet, the same platform used to bomb Iran. That to me is the message. And that to me does indicate
That's
there's
honestly that's why are my predictions for this all came through. Is like this is, in my opinion, again, like and that guys, like, and that is the worrying aspect of this for me. It's like you can paint the picture, you can say whatever you want, and I know there's analysts out there that are gonna be like, oh, this is the best thing to ever happen. Them sitting down in the meeting is good. World peace is gonna happen tomorrow. The truth is we're dealing with two leaders that are both in their own right strong men. I personally believe, and I'm not siding with Russia when I say this, I'm just telling you at the end of the day, just telling you, and all the listeners, the person that is trained to be the strongman in this situation, and the person that has proven to be a strongman through his entire career is Putin. And the person that is attempting to be a strongman needs some more work on it and has a very, very limited temper, an incredibly limited temper, is Trump. And we just saw this with the Ayatollah not going to talk with the United States in regards to the Iran nuclear program. And what happened? Trump lost his temper and a B-2 strike mission happened. Again, that is the worrying aspect of this situation for me. That's why I am so warmongering about it. I've been warmongering about it since 2018. I've been warmongering about it in 2019 when the invasion was about to, when the invasion was like theorized by analysts. And obviously in 2021 and 2022, when all of this stuff started to actually unfold. And then, of course, in February 2022, when the invasion happened, I was like, holy shit, guys, we need to start paying attention to this. This is it. Like, this is the situation. This is the USSR trying to reformulate itself. And I got shot down left and right. Matt, Stefano, before even Artorias or Bluff was even thought of, we would be sitting on live podcasts, much to the same extent that this is, and there would be a guy arguing about the Putin's intentions with this conflict. And again, I know I'm the warmonger, whatever you want to call me, but at the end of the day, I've been right about the major points of this conflict. And I think that this is another situation where, again, I hope I'm wrong, just as I was saying in January 2022. I hope I'm wrong. But at the end of the day, as you just said, Stefano, this is major signaling, incredible signaling. And I guess we'll find out in probably what 20 hours, give or take, of what the actual situation is going to be at hand. But I don't see it faring well for the world and world peace. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah, this kind of it reminds me of if you go on to like Google Earth and you look at the major Air Force bases, you're going to see the B-52s, out on the runway. I'm sure that's by design. It this is a show of force, and with the damage that's been done to the Russian military by Ukraine, Putin would be very naive to think that the United States was not a superior military power, especially, just looking at conventional capabilities. One of the things to keep in mind is I'm sure that there have been war plans drawn up, especially as the United States was so concerned about climbing this escalation ladder. And there were all these questions around, what do we do if Russia oversteps? And one of those things that was sort of bandied about was the idea of using conventional force against the Black Sea Fleet. I hope that's not something that we would see, but it's worth noting that Trump's DoD doesn't have the same limitations or brakes installed that the DoD is known for, and a lot of people in that infrastructure have been placed by Trump because they're willing to do what Trump wants them to do, and so that could be concerning depending on how Trump feels this meeting went. And him getting up and walking out of the room or telling Putin to leave is a possibility, just as it's a possibility that Putin's going to start talking about how Alexander II never should have given the United States Alaska, and how that's all a farce. I just it's a really dangerous situation when we don't have the people with the institutional knowledge or the people who care about those institutions sitting in the room during this discussion. And that is something that could be very dangerous with Trump's temper. So I don't really see necessarily a best case scenario here. Also, Christian, I don't know what analysts are thinking this is necessarily a good idea, but that
Brett Tolenko, New Jersey.
okay. Yeah, analysts. But yeah, most of what I've seen is a lot of concern around this. And so, like you said, we're going to find out in 20 hours. I'm not necessarily opposed to Putin seeing, military aircraft on the tarmac, though.
I mean, I've always believed in more deterrence equals more strength and more peace, but again, the issue that I see is the US is not at war yet. Russia is at war. I'll push back on your point, Stefano. I know that the average perspective sits at, okay, Russia doesn't actually have that strong of a military, but I have always said from day one of this war that Russia's not going to send in the best of the best. I mean, the entire war setup was VDV is going to go in, take over Kyiv, and then it's just going to be basically a holding of local government institutions, and that's what happened with the war. Obviously, when VDV got completely taken off guard because CIA was like, hey, Ukraine, this is what's going to happen. They're going to try to go for Hostomel, et cetera, et cetera. And obviously, the absolute decimation of the Russian forces that were put in. I still believe wholeheartedly that if push came to shove and Russia wanted to fight a war with the West, they could still hold their grounds, at least at a point where there would be a lot of damage inflicted on the West. I still wholeheartedly believe that. I don't think they have a weak military. I don't think this is going to be US versus Mexican cartels, for example.
No, no. I mean, of course they could do damage. It's just as somebody who grew up and was trained as an armor officer in 2013, we vastly overestimated the Russian military and their capabilities, and their ability to. I think the perfect example is what we're seeing right now in Donetsk and the Russian offensives. They're not even following their own doctrine, and the reason they can't follow their own doctrine is they don't have the capability to follow their own doctrine. Clearly damage can be done. I'm not disputing that. But I remember having conversations back in the day during my time when I was still with the government, and senior military officials were saying Russia was viewed prior to February 2022 as this 800-pound gorilla. And the war clearly made a lot of people realize the severe weaknesses that is going on, and I think that is the issue that I think Russia also understands. And so I also believe that in President Putin's mind, the last thing he wants is a direct involvement of Western military forces. I think they're going to go everything as close to possible without kinetic force on force. And I think Putin is trying to see where that line is, and he's trying to get as close as possible to that line. But they understand that they can't seize even the entirety of the Donetsk, Oblast after 3 years. Their ability to challenge Finland, Poland, Norway, Sweden individually is a lot harder, regardless of just NATO and the U.S. military as a whole. And I do believe that is something where the B-2 bomber deployment is very interesting because it does show, hey, maybe we can't cause as much economic damage as we are. And let's be real, there is significant problems with the Russian economy and the necessity of the war economy. So there's still ways that can be hurt. But militarily, that is a significant deterrence. And President Putin and the Russian military have done absolutely nothing to challenge NATO's Article 5. And even with a lackluster, let's say, commitment, let's say that there's a lackluster commitment to Article 5, there's a lot of European partners that can punch way above their weight. And I'm looking at Poland specifically, that can handle this problem set. Although damage would be done, I think President Putin is very much understanding that although he might be delusional Ukraine, he is very much aware of NATO's military strength and the concerns that that has within his own military.
Yeah, and I think with Finland, joining NATO, two major developments there is the Baltic Fleet and cutting off St. Petersburg, making that port very difficult to operate out of. Obviously, the Black Sea Fleet is sort of a non-starter. And then also keep in mind the North Fleet in Murmansk. They're basically two lines of supply up there over land, and that's the E-105 highway and a railroad that also sort of parallels that. And those are both very close to the border with Finland. So I think that's, under 100 miles. That's certainly something that would enter the calculus there.
I don't disagree with any of your guys' points. I see if the Sino-American War kicks off or this kicks off even further, like I think other fronts will open up. I don't think it's going to be just I think it's going to be a moment of opportunism, basically, not just necessarily what the current status quo is, if that makes sense.
And Russia has a lot of people, and he's shown that he's willing to throw them into the fray. Uh, the last point I would make, just in terms of what Putin is gaining from this, he's due to meet with Xi in China, I think sometime in September or October, and this sort of elevates his standing there in those discussions. It obviously doesn't do anything to change the fact that China is more powerful economically and likely militarily, and also has a lot of people, has a lot more people. But it does give him a little bit more standing.
No, and I think that's the area where I think a lot of people are also trying to really understand is and I think it's that's the irony. I'm going to use that word, irony, of the situation where President Putin believes it is his destiny to, let's say, reconstitute either the USSR 2.0 or the Russian Empire, but the costs associated to achieve that is astronomical, both in human toll, economic toll, and military toll. And it kind of falls back in that area of I think I don't think a lot of people have talked about the issue affecting President Putin, and I believe the West has done a terrible job of framing it and calling out Putin's delusion. Like I think the perfect example, I remember a pro-Ukrainian Twitter account, mentioned this, and they said, let's imagine this is the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, and the U.S. military got kicked out of Baghdad, but managed to seize Mosul and Basra. Nobody would be claiming that the U.S. is winning the war, and it would be nothing short of an absolute disaster for America. That's what happened with Russia. And I think the framing of the conflict needs to be changed. I think a lot of people are, I think one of the areas where maybe Russia definitely has somewhat of a leg up is in that information warfare space that portrays Russia as this behemoth. But I think John McCain was right. Russia is a gas station with nuclear weapons. And I just view everything historically from 2022 forward as confirming that, because clearly the Russians never improved after the Russian-Georgia War of 2008. They went through huge modernization, change of doctrine. They incorporated the battalion tactical group because of the failures of the Russia-Georgia War. And it was an utter disaster in 2022. Regardless of faulty assumption of intelligence, any military would have been able to quickly adapt and overcome that. And they didn't. And I think that's something that we just need to highlight as well. And I think that requires more analysis.
Well, I think we don't give enough credit, more credits due to the United States IC for giving the information, as well as the war plans to Ukraine and how the US would respond to a situation like that. And I know that I don't want to jump down the rabbit hole of like pissing off like Ukrainian people by saying that, but I don't think that is given enough credit. But yeah, Matt, any last thoughts? And then I guess we'll just wrap this up and we'll record another one when the summit's over, whatever that time that ends. Probably give it a few hours though, just to see how the dust settles, and then we'll have an episode up probably Saturday.
Yeah, that sounds good to me. You mentioned the IC. Hopefully, Trump is listening to them, because we know in Helsinki he sided with Putin over his own IC, but it's a incredible apparatus, and so hopefully he's getting the best guidance there. And while we're focusing on Russia, we've kind of taken our eyes off China. So I do think that's something that in an upcoming episode we should discuss, China's role on the world stage. I think they're our largest strategic partner. I don't think anyone on this episode would disagree with that, but we should have a conversation looking at what are the implications for Taiwan and uh, China's goals on developing a blue water navy and South China Sea and the Kowtow. So we can discuss all of that in a future episode, but I think for now we've got our predictions on the book, and I look forward to discussing the summit after it concludes. So
Likewise.
thanks for joining us, Christian.
Thank you very much. Hope everybody has a good rest of your day. And yeah, we will see what happens.
This has been the bottom line up front, and we will talk to you soon.